CSIS 2440 is filmed before a live studio audience.
Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of a flashback here. This is our final day talking about object-oriented programming, but we're not going to learn any new object-oriented concepts. We're not going to learn more about classes or anything like that. We're going to use a PHP built-in class and object system. But now that we understand the syntax, we can get our heads around this, and we're finally going to make all of our database stuff like fully secure. Okay, we've gotten close with the password hashing and all that stuff, but we weren't fully protected from SQL injection, right? You recall the couple lectures back we talked about how we could do SQL injection. Well, now we've got a way to prevent that. We've always had the way, I just haven't shown it to you, right? All right, so let's remember how we do this, and I want to make sure that the way we've been doing the database connection is like in our brains solid. So I've already got those constants defined right there, and of course we would have our if statement to determine if we're on the local server or the remote, but we're not going to bother with that. So this first step we always do is what? Yeah, a connection. Yeah, Mysqli. And it's called connect, right? And we just pass in the host, the user, the password, and the database, right? That's nothing new. We've done that a billion times. And then the next thing we do is we have a variable usually that holds our command that we're going to run. So we'll just do something simple here, like we'll do select star from user, right? That's the user table. Let's make sure we have the database open so you know what we're looking at here. Okay, right here in the palindromes, I have a table called user, and there are some passwords. Now I've removed the hashing so we can see the passwords here, and that's just for the sake of today's lecture. Normally, of course, those would be hashed. Okay, so we're selecting everything from user. This will just display all of that data right there, all right? And then, what's the next thing we do? Yeah, we run a query, right? And we usually call it results. Mysqli, like did it again. Mysqli query. And then we pass in the connection and we pass in the query we're going to run. And of course, remember, we can just paste that right there, right? It's just a separate variable because sometimes the query can get pretty long and messy and it's just cleaner to keep it separate. So we run the results, and then once we do that, then we loop through it, right? So this is the part I'm going to take an extra minute here to make sure we really understand this, because this one function causes more confusion than anything else when it comes to database stuff. So what we normally do is this, right? We say row equal, and we do this in a loop, but we're going to leave that out for a minute. Mysqli fetch array, right? Remember this one? We pass in the results, and we say we want it to be a Mysqli associative array, right? Okay, normally we do that in a loop and we're going to loop through it. But I want to make sure you see exactly what happens here. So I'm going to dump this variable out here, this function here, var dump. This actually returns an array. I think we knew that. Okay, it returns an array, and I'm going to tack onto here a couple of line breaks. And again, normally this happens in a loop. But this, what you're about to see, is a little bit strange, and this is what messes with people's heads a little bit. What do you expect to see when I dump this variable out? How many records? Let's go with that. So 3 rows. Did you mean columns, like the ID, user, and password, right? So 3 columns, okay. And what else? How many rows? So right now, look at the database. Right, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So I'm assuming most people would expect to see 6 records, right? However, that is not what will happen. We'll just see the first one, yeah. So remember, look at the order here. It's Butthead, Lizard, Bob, Billy, Kid, and Maynard. Okay, and we have, of course, a typo. Results equals Mysqli query. What did that message say? Unexpected results, which means, I do this every time. The semicolon, yeah, I put it here because we need it there also. And yeah, anyway. Okay, so look what it's dumping out here. It's just the first record. It's butthead, and it's his password happens to be password, as you can see in the database here. But look at this. If I do this again, I do that twice in a row, look what happens. The next one, I should have got it. Oh, I meant to echo that here. Hold on. So look what happened now. The second time it did the next record, Lizard, right here. Let's do it again. It's going to do Bob and then Billy and so forth, right? So if I go in here and I duplicate that line again and again, we'll do 4 of them. Each time, the same exact code returns something completely different, right? This is a magic function. I don't know how it works or why or what the behind the scenes code is. I don't really want to know, right? All I know is it knows how to, every time you call it, it's like, oh, they called me again, they must want the next record. Oh, you called me again, you must want the next record, right? And so on down the line. So right now, we're on Bob, so how many's left? We got Kid and Maynard. So let's do 2 more. All right, now we got 6 of them coming out. The last one is Maynard and Good Stuff. Let's do it one last time. What do you expect to have come out? That's a good guess. It goes back to the first record. If it went back to the first record, let's think about what would happen if that were in the loop. Yeah, we'd have an infinite loop, right? So it's going to return something that tells us that it's done, right? So refresh, and it gives us null, which is the third thing in PHP that equals false. Everything is true except for 0, false, the word false, the Boolean value false, I should say, and null, right? The actual value null, not the word null, okay? So this actually will register as false. So when we do this whole thing in a while loop, right, everything we're doing right now we've done before. This is none of the new stuff yet. We're going to get there in just a minute. But let's comment this whole mess out for a second. And we just want this piece right here, okay? And we normally go row equals that, right? And in fact, if I were to do that and then say echo row, or not echo row, var dump row, and then again, we'll do some line breaks here, right? If we do this, all we're doing is assigning this, rather than dumping it out like we've been doing down here, we're assigning it to this thing called row, and then we're dumping out row, and then we're echoing the line break. So if I look at it, it's just the same thing we had a minute ago, right? Butthead's the first one, and if I do this a couple more times, each time, it's not an iteration here, it's just me running the same function a bunch of times. On line 14, row gets reassigned to the second row in the table, and then we dump it out, not echo it, but dump it out. And then on line 15, it gets reassigned and just keeps overwriting the value of row. And we save it, refresh it, and we get this. And then we'll do it a final time, and this time we get null. Okay? So conceptually, does that make sense? I didn't explain that the first time we looked at this stuff because already our brains hurt that day, right? I didn't want to make it worse. But this is an important thing to wrap our heads around. Okay, so now let's do this the way we always do it, which is inside of a loop. So let's comment all this out again. We'll probably just delete it in a minute. Normally we do this, while this, and then we do something inside of our while loop, right? Well, we know what's going to happen. The first time we run this, we're going to get butthead, right? The second time we run it, we're going to get the next record. It's the same thing as if I just did it 7 times in a row, or 6, or however many there are, right? But now it's just in a loop. That's the whole point of a loop, right? To prevent us from having to do things multiple times. So this right here will do exactly the same thing that these lines were doing a minute ago. So if I refresh it, and now the only reason it doesn't print out null is because when it got null, the loop stopped, right? So all that's different now is we're just simply saying, while this is true. Well, we know it's true because, look, this is what it's holding. That is true. Remember, everything's true, except for 0, false, and null, right? So this sees that this is true. It dumps this out. It goes to the next record because that's just the way this function works, and it keeps going. Does that make sense? Now, let me show you something weird, right? What if I were to do this right here again and var dump this, right? And get rid of this variable here, okay? What do you expect the results to be this time? It'll actually be slightly different. Remember, every time we call this function, it gets the next record, right? So it's going to get the first record. It's going to get the first record right there on line 13. And then immediately on line 15, it's going to get the second record and dump it out. So it's going to just go to the next record because every time you run that function, it goes to the next record. Just magic, right? So it's going to get every other record. See that? Does that make sense? The first time through, it actually did grab Butthead right there. He's the first record. But I didn't echo that out. I didn't print it out. I didn't do anything. And then I ran that again right now. And so it dumps out the second thing. And then it goes here and it grabs the third thing, but I didn't do anything with it. But I ran it again, it grabs the fourth thing, and so on down the line. Okay. Have I beaten a dead horse? Feel all right about this? Okay. So let's go back to the way we really want to do this, where we say rows, or row equals that. And of course, we don't do a var dump. We do something with the data, right? Well, the whole reason we want it to be an associative array is so that I can grab the idth element or the userth element or the passeth element, right? So that's why we do something like this. We say echo row user, right? And then we get this. Whoops, wrong page. We get that. Okay, how are we feeling about all of this? All this is basically review, but I added a little extra layer there for you, right? Okay, now, what we've never done is this. Mysqli underscore num. You can actually get it as a numbered array, an index array. So instead of user here, what would I put? Take a look. Right, 0, 1, or 2. And if I want user, that's which number? 1, right? The 1 element. ID is the 0th element, user is the 1 element, and pass is the second element, right? So if I just put a 1 there, like a normal array that we're used to, right, in all languages, and I refresh it, we're going to get the same exact data right here on the page. Okay? If I try to do the userth element, I'm going to get an error because this is a numbered array, not an associative array, and I get this error, right? Undefined index user. There is no such user as the or index as the userth element. Okay, however, you can also do both. So you can get, it comes back both ways. Now I don't know really much of a use case where you'd need to do that necessarily, but we now have the userth element, and that works just fine. And I can replace that with the 1 element, and that will also work just fine. So with all this in mind, there are other ways to get back an associative array instead of Mysqli fetch array. And I'm going to show you this other way because it's going to lead us down the path of how to do this in the object-oriented way. There's another function, instead of called fetch array, it's actually called fetch associative, ASOC, okay? And all you got to do is pass in the results because the function itself by default is an associative array being returned. And that will now give us an error because I have a 1 in the brackets there, right? So that gives me an error, but if I change that to user or pass or whatever we're looking for, now we get the data again. So this is another way to do the same thing. Okay, you feel okay about that? Yeah, so the fetch array is the fetch associative array with extra stuff, right? So this one only can fetch the results as an associative array. The fetch underscore array can fetch it in as a number, as an associative, or as both, right? And so if you need a number, then you can do the other way. There may be a function here where it's, num or something like that. I don't know if it does exist. I don't know what that is, if there is one. But you can always use the other way that we've been doing it since the beginning, right? Yes, good question. Yeah, this behaves exactly the same as the fetch array, where every time you run it, just grabs the next record. Exactly right, yep. Okay, other questions on this? So we're still basically where we've always been, right? I'm gonna add one more thing which we've briefly touched on before, and that is, what if your connection doesn't work, right? You don't want the rest of your code to show up, because if your connection doesn't work, some weird stuff might happen, and you might be displaying stuff you don't want to display. So if you don't get a connection, you want to die. You want the die function we've used before, and all that does is stop anything else from running. It just stops right there on line 8 in this case, if we put it there. So what do we look for? Well, there's a thing that's part of the connection that is called, or it's just one of the functions that's part of the whole MySQLi world, called Mysqli Error. Connect error, I believe, is what it's called. There we go, connect error, okay? Like that. So this function returns false if there's no errors, and it will return an error if there's an error, right? So all you got to do is just say if that's an error, if there's something there, die, right? We'll just start there, okay? So if this returns an error, then die. Well, right now when we run it, it doesn't die, but let's make it die. Let's just change like our palindromes database to something that doesn't exist, right? Palindromes 2 does not exist. I refresh it, and it dies. Gives us an error, okay? So what you can do here, you can also echo out the message in a separate little thing here. Inside your die parameter, you can say connection failed, and then you can concatenate on this actual value right here, right? That make sense? Okay. So now it'll not only die, but it also gives us this little thing here, connection unknown database, right? And let me just show you a couple of the errors so you're familiar with what they look like. So we'll go back to a good database, but we'll change the user. And this error will be access denied for root W. Means that there's no user, or maybe there's a user but the password's wrong, right? You'll get the same exact error in the event that the password's wrong. So we'll put root back. We'll change our password here to just an underscore there. And we get the exact same error, user root access denied, okay? So we'll go back to here, and then if we put the wrong local host, this one takes a minute, but it'll time out, and it says that there's no such address, right? I couldn't find it. So these can be useful. Now this stuff here with all these warnings, there are actually ways to suppress that in PHP. You can do it in your Apache, you can do it in your PHP INI file, you can actually do it right in your code, lots of different ways. And so if we were to have suppressed that, which I'm not going to bother doing, but if we were, then these warnings would not be there. And the reason that's useful is because you don't want to show file paths, right? And so the warnings would be suppressed, and all you'd see is this message underneath the highlight there, right? And so the user comes to your website and they just see that message. Maybe you put something in that message that says contact your system administrator or click here for help or something like that, right? But it doesn't show any file paths. Okay, questions on all that? The other thing you can do, instead of having the error message come out, there is another parameter, or another function I should say, that's called error NO, which stands for error number, okay? And so rather than echoing out the actual message here, it'll echo out a number, an error number. So let's break this again. And now it just says connection failed 1049. Or you can even say error number, right? And now it says connection failed, error number 1049. Now, if you look that error up on Google, it will tell you what it means. No such database. But the nice thing about this is it doesn't tell you the name of the database, right? Whereas here, if I left this as error and it shows the actual message, when I refresh it, it's going to say no such database palindromes, right? Which is just revealing too much information, maybe, okay? All right, so one or the other is good depending on if you're in development mode or if you're actually running this live on your server, right? So it's probably better to stick with the error no number, okay? Okay, so what questions do we have about that? That's the only real new thing we've talked about, I think, other than this array here, or this function here. Okay, you ready to do this the real way now? This way is fine, and we talked about how we can use those functions like the HTML entities, right, where we can strip out the things and turn it into text that can't give SQL injection, right? Well, this next way is the official way you should be doing this to prevent SQL injection. So let's just remember what the heck that is, okay? And if you want the specific details, make sure you watch that other video. Okay, so let's look at the basic idea of what this is about. We would get some user input, let's call it user, and it would be equal to the post that they put in a form that we would have, right? We would do our is set business to make sure it's actually got values in it. We're not going to bother making a form today, but let's just pretend that the user put in as actual input butthead, right? Get that from your form, make sure you properly grab it and everything, making sure you don't have any issues with it being blank or not filled out and all that. But now you get butthead, and that is something that is in our database. If we look right here, there's butthead right there, okay? So the way we would do this is we would say select star from user where user equals, don't forget the quotes. Remember last time took us a few minutes to recognize that problem? Okay, so we're putting quotes around the user butthead, right? Make sense? So when I run this, we should just have it display butthead. Oh, I didn't fix the database there. Let's fix that. There we go. Okay, butthead. Or if we put, I think Billy is one of them, it's going to display Billy, so forth, right? That's the user input. So again, if you watch that other video, we saw that the user could put in things like delete from user or whatever, and it would just delete all the records. And again, the way you would do that, this syntax that I'm doing here won't even work. But in the other video, I show you how to do that, right? So the thing we're about to do will separate the query from the parameter, which is Billy in this case, or delete, whatever, and it will make sure that it becomes 100% just a string and it cannot be run. That's what we're about to do, okay? And in order to do that, we've got to switch everything over to object-oriented ways of doing this stuff, okay? So for the moment, I'm going to remove this die business because that's a new thing we learned today, and I don't want to hurt your brains more than I have to, okay? So we're going to just get this out of here for now, and we'll stick with just changing the stuff we know to be object-oriented, okay? If you were to look this up on the PHP documentation, in fact, let's do that, you will see that it's actually just an alias, okay? So MySQL Connect, and right here it tells you it's an alias of this. Now, what the heck is that? Yeah, it's a constructor of an object or of a class. And what's the class called? MySQLi, right? So this is actually an alias, right? It's a function that mimics the behavior of, that's what an alias basically is. It's a function that is an alias of the actual constructor of the MySQL class. So remember, how do we make a new class? What did we do before? Like when we wanted to make a new animal, we said animal equals what? New animal, right? And then we passed in the parameters. Well, that's the exact same thing we're going to do right here. We're going to make a new MySQLi. New MySQLi. So now we're doing an instantiation of the MySQLi class, and we're calling it con. So now con is an object. It's an instance of the MySQLi class. Just like Fido equals new dog, Fido is an instance of the dog class, right? Same thing, okay? All right, so far so good? Right now, everything will still work as we've been doing it. No problem at all, okay? We refresh it and it still works. There's Billy, no problem, okay? Next up, let's convert the next piece to the object version of this. And you'll see this doesn't need to change, right? It's just a query, it's just a variable. But this right here, where we say MySQLi query, well, now this is a connection. It's an object of the MySQLi. And maybe connection is not necessarily the best word anymore, but that's fine. We'll just stick with that. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to call this, remember, this is a MySQLi object. We're going to call its function called query. And it takes in as a parameter a query, right? So this is still the same thing we've been doing, right? And if I refresh it, we still get Billy, no problem. And just to make sure that's really working, we'll change that to kid, which is another one. Still works, right? Okay. I'm going slow here because this is going to get really wonky in just a minute. But I want to make sure we're following along so far. We good? Okay. So this is just an object that has a function called query, and that's it. We're just calling that function right there. What kind of object is it? It's an object of that class right there. Okay. Now, in here, same idea. Okay. We're going to call the function on this, right? This right here, results, is now an object because this returns an object to results. Okay. So now results is an object. Well, we can actually now call its functions. Results has a function called fetch assoc or associative, right? So step one, we made an object called con, which is an instance of the MySQLi class, just like Fido was an instance of the dog class. So this is now an object. Con is an object. Okay, well, con has a function that's part of the MySQLi class that's called query. You pass it in a query, which we did on line 11. We created on line 11. And this returns another object, right? So this result is now an object. Well, this object called results, it has a function or a method, if you will, called fetch associative. This will all give me the exact same thing. It will run just fine. If I refresh it, no errors. It still gives me kid. And just to prove it's working, we'll change this to butthead. And everything's good. Okay. How we feel about all of that before I get into the real reason we're here today. All right. What we're about to do is what's called a prepared statement. Prepared statements will protect you from SQL injection. It will protect you from anybody doing that little trick we were looking at a minute ago. If somehow they were able to, in the field, fill this out from, well, not star, but from user or something like that, somehow in there. What we're about to do just turns this into plain old text that is just nothing more than that. So in other words, if somehow they got that in there, which they could just by typing it in the form, all that would happen on line 11 is they would think they're looking for a username called delete from user. Like that's the guy's name. That's it. That's all. It just protects you from that. Now the HTML entities and those other ones we looked at before also do this, but they're not as solid as this. And you'll see why when we do it in a second. But this can be very confusing. So channel your energy and focus on this. This is crazy. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to prepare this statement. And so we're actually going to call the prepare function instead of the query. Rather than just running the query, we're going to run the prepare function. What the heck does the prepare function do? First of all, it takes this query right here and it sends it to the server, but we have to modify it slightly. Rather than putting the actual value there, we're going to put in a placeholder, which is the question mark. That's actually what you use, is a question mark. Okay? So what you're saying now is select star from user where user equals something, some placeholder. And then this line of 14 takes that and sends it to the server and the database server, and the server's waiting. Okay, where user equals what? What's the parameter? But what we've done now is separated out the command, select star from user, from the actual parameter of butthead or some crazy SQL injection phrase. Okay? So we've separated that out. But we now have to tell it, hey, this prepared statement here, here's what the parameter is. Here's what you're going to replace that question mark with. What are we going to replace the question mark with? Yeah, it's just going to be user. So we just have to tell this prepared statement here, hey, by the way, now that you have the query, here's your parameter, user. We have to tell it that, okay? So what's starting to happen here, this variable called results, definitely not the right word anymore, right? I mean, you can call it whatever you want, right? But for clarity's sake, I should say, a better variable name would be statement. And in fact, in the industry, that is what you'll see when people do this kind of thing. You'll see either statement like that or statement. But again, call it Beavis, call it Knucklehead. It doesn't matter what you call it. But just for clarity, we're going to stick with statement here. So this statement here is equal to whatever this is. We're assigning it this to this, okay? So this is handed off to the server, this prepared statement. It's prepared, it's ready to go. Now we need to bind the parameters to it, okay? Right now there's only one parameter, user. So in order to do that, we take the statement and we call its bind param function, okay? That bind parameters, we need to tell it what are the parameters that you're going to be using. Well, it's user. We said that a second ago, right? Okay? So far, so good? So again, let's be clear what's happening here. In fact, let's just put this for the moment right here. Okay, and we'll comment that out for just a second. So line 14 is saying, hey, get your connection object, and I want you to prepare this statement. How do we prepare it? We hand it off to the server with everything but the actual parameters. Right now, the parameters, we just put a question mark there. Then on line 15, we say, okay, now take that statement that you just made, and I want you to bind this to it right there. What this does is it separates out the actual statement of select star from user where user. It separates that out from the parameters. And so line 15 says, hey, this is nothing but a parameter. It is not a SQL command. It is not anything that you can run. It's not anything that, if it looks like a command, I don't care. It's not a command, right? So if the input was this, delete from user, doesn't matter. This line here says, I don't care what this says, treat it as just a parameter, not some sort of command you can run, right? All right, so we'll go back to butthead here. We're not done yet though, right? We got more to go.
But I'm not done yet.
So now that I've bound these parameters, the next thing we've got to do is actually execute the command, execute the statement. So statement, and we call the execute function, execute, right? So now these three things are kind of like replacing what we used to do on line 11, right? It's now a much better, well-prepared statement that's ready to go. We still don't have the results yet, right? Right? We still have to get the results, which we'll do that in a second. But this chunk of 3 lines here is essentially the better way to do what we used to do on line 11. Of course, line 11 used to look like this, right? It had user there, okay? So these 3 statements here replace what we used to do here back in the day when we did it the old, not so good way, okay? Then we need to run the query, right? We need to actually get the results, okay? And the function is actually called getResult. So we want to get the results of this, and we want to take those results and put it into our results variable, okay? Or whatever you want to call the variable, but results is a good name. Results equals the statement, and then call the getResult singular. That will bite you. It bites me all the time because you're saying in your head, I want to get the results, but it's actually single. Okay, getResult, even though it is all of them. Okay, so there we go. Now, if I run this exactly the way it is, okay, then everything will work just fine. And if we refresh it, oh, there's one thing we're missing. Okay, right here on the bind parameter, we have to tell it what kind of data that is. Okay? It's a string. So who are we telling this to? We're telling this to the SQL database server. So we say, hey, this thing you're about to look at is a string. That's what the S stands for. If it were an integer, we would say I. If it were a floating point or a double, we would say D. Okay? So we're doing string for S. But this now will work just fine, so let's refresh it. And sure enough, no errors. There's Butthead. And let's do Billy. And there's that. Now, looking at this, nothing changed, but now everything is secure, right? And that's one of the things that's kind of sort of frustrating a little bit about securing things, is nothing looks different to anybody, but your code is way more involved, right? But now this is very secure and there's no SQL injection happening here. So, I know this is a lot of stuff, okay? It's kind of crazy. Well, we can add more parameters here. For example, maybe we also need the password, right? And it's, what is Billy's? I think his is kid, like Billy the Kid. Look at our command here. We'll say where user is something, and pass, which is the name of the field, by the way, pass, P-A-S-S, where pass equals something, some parameter, right? Well, it's going to be whatever they entered in the form. And then we need to say, okay, the next two things are strings. First one is called user, the second one is called pass. So string user, string pass. Can you dig it?
Can you dig it?
All right, refresh, and it should give us Billy still because his password is kid. Oh, then maybe it's not. Oh, it's Billy Bob. Yeah, so it didn't give us the record, right? Which is good. Okay. So we'll go with Bob now. Refresh it. And there it gives us the record. Okay. Now you may notice that when I refresh this, watch the lag. Oh, that was pretty quick. Let's change something and then watch the lag. We'll go back to kid here. See that? Took a second. Well, we have some connections and stuff open here, and we've talked about before making sure you close your connection and close everything. When it comes to prepared statements, it's even more important than ever. Okay? So you want to, at the end of your code here, take your statement and close it. Call the close function. Also do the same thing on your connection. Okay? Both of those have a close function. I don't know if we'll see much of a difference right now, but that can definitely, over time, slow down your server. Okay? So refresh, and we get nothing, and then let's put back Bob here. There we go. That was a lot quicker. Okay? All right, so this is big picture. We're going to do some more stuff here in a minute, but I want to make sure that's sinking in. Feel okay about all this? Okay. So let's go ahead and put our die back in here, because now you can handle this little extra piece of business here. I think we're okay. Let's put this right here. And again, look, we need to change this to the object-oriented way now, right? So instead of calling that function here, we're going to look at the connection and see if the, what's it called? Connect underscore error. Notice there, it's not a function. It's a property, right? Okay, so that property gets assigned a value if there is an error. And if there isn't an error, then it doesn't get assigned a value. And then, of course, we're going to echo that out if we did get it. So right here, we're just going to echo that error out, whatever that message is. So let's test this, make sure we didn't break anything. We still have Billy, nice. Let's change this to something that's not real. And now we get this, and we have fatal error, unknown database palindromes. Now again, we could put the number here, error no. Also notice, I can put error no here as well. If this is true, this will also be true. They will always both be true or both be false. Okay? So it doesn't matter. What really matters is which one do you display. Well, let's display the number so we don't reveal too much information. Error number 1049. And so let's look that up real quick. So we'll say PHP Mysqli Error 1049, error code 1049. Let's see what this says. Unknown database, right? Right, the first hit says unknown database. Well, if we left the message in there, the problem is it tells the actual database that we're trying to hit, and that's no good. So we refresh it, and now it says unknown database palindromes. Well, now they're seeing what we're trying to do in our code. So it's better to give them the number. They go look up the number, and then they see, oh, it's unknown database, but they don't know what the database name is, right? Okay. Okay, so again, we can see the value of this, right? If I put the error number here rather than the actual message, then they don't see the name of the database. But they still see all of this right here, right? They see file paths, which if it were on your server, they'd be seeing your actual server file path. That's no good, okay? So what we can do here is actually suppress those messages. I mentioned this earlier. There's a function that does that. It's called error reporting. And if you set that to 0, then it will not do any warnings that reveals that kind of information, right? If you go into the PHP.NET documentation, you can look up what the other parameters are besides 0. But 0 just gets rid of everything. And now it's the only thing that shows is the stuff you put in there, right? The other day when we were using the try-catch statement, right? That's a really good example of where it just only shows the errors you want to show and not all the warning stuff. And if along for the ride comes any of the regular PHP stuff, you'll want to run this function here at the top of all your code. In fact, a good common practice is to have this showing only when you're on localhost. So if you're not on localhost, then you put error reporting 0, otherwise you leave it alone. That way when you're running it locally and testing it, you can see the errors. So now this is very useful when doing a select statement, because oftentimes if your site is, hey, look up a user record, and they enter the name that they want to look up, right? And in the little form field, they put some sort of SQL injection, you're protected now. These are called prepared statements, and you're protected now. And now that you understand objects a little bit, hopefully the syntax makes some sense. It's just a matter of remembering this extra crap here. That takes a little bit of practice, okay? Now, the next thing is, this can also be useful, obviously, for when you're doing an actual insert, right? If you're inserting into the database, you got to be super careful that people don't put in some crazy stuff, okay? So let's change this statement here, which again, if we wanted to, this could be a separate SQL command, right? Let's go ahead and go back to that model. We'll change this to SQL. And in fact, hold on, back up. I'm going to make a new page so that this code stays. And then I'll make a second page, which is called inserting or something like that, so that you guys can have this code and then the other code that we're about to do in a separate page. So let's do that. Just copy this. Okay, so now we can overwrite it and not worry about it. So let's go back to this model again where we have something like this. And we put it here. And then we put the SQL command here. Right? That just keeps it a little bit cleaner for me, but I wanted to have it down there so you could see that this is all working together, right? So this is the same thing though. If we run it, we should still get the same thing. We need to go back here, and this time we're going to insert, and we might still have that error there. Yeah, so let's fix that. Okay, so this still works where we have this query right here, right? Okay, what questions do we have about this idea here? The binding, the parameters, all that stuff. We good? Okay, let's do an insert statement now. So let's say that we want to, our query now is going to be insert into the user table, and we want to insert into the ID field, the user field, and the password field. Now, for the record, our ID field, you never have to manually insert into it because it's an auto increment, but you can manually if you want to, and I want to so I can show you how to do integers down here. Okay, that's the only reason we're doing this, but normally it's just automatic. Values, normally you'd put the values there, right? But this is a prepared statement, so we're going to say ID, comma, user, comma, password. Right, we're adding a new user. Make sense? Then down here in our preparation, we prepare the statement here, which hands this off to the server. Then we need to say, hey, the first of the three fields you're about to look at, one is an ID, or sorry, an integer, I should say. The next one's a string, next one's a string, right? And then we do ID right here, which we haven't created yet. Make sense? So we need to get ID from the user, right, or from wherever, and we're going to go with 10. Obviously, in the real world, you don't let the user just pick their ID, right? I'm only doing this to show you how this binding stuff works, right? And they're going to create a username called Butthead, and the password is WordPass. Okay, so that's brand new. We got this from the user input, from a form, and then we're going to run this command right here, and we're saying, hey, the first thing is an integer, second thing is a string, third thing's a string, integer, string, string. Then we execute. There are no results to get, right? So we don't need this part. That's only when you're getting data. This is where we're putting data in. So this is it. Right here, what we're looking at is all we need, okay? So refresh it, and let's look here, make sure, make sure that in user, there's no butthead with a password of WordPass, no ID number 9. We refresh this page, and now we come back here, and there it is. Okay? Let's clear out all this stuff here because it's not necessary for this page. Don't need these comments because they're in the other page. And this is pretty clean code here, right? It's not a lot going on here. So these two lines here are connection stuff, right? We're creating the connection object, and we're making sure that it actually worked. It actually connected, it didn't fail. And then these four are together, right? Where we create / prepare and execute the command / statement, whatever, right? That's what's happening here. And then here, we close out our connections, and by connections I mean the literal connection object and this statement business, right? That's it. The only thing that's extra is when we're retrieving data, we have that extra thing where we're getting the results. That's it. Okay? How are we feeling? Great. All right, let's do one more where it's going to be an update. So again, I'll copy this page so we can keep this code intact here for you guys. So we'll copy this insert and let's change it. So now we're going to update the user with a new password or something like that, right? So in this case, we're going to, let's look at it and say update user number 3, who is lizard. His password is currently duck. Okay. So let's ignore user here as input. And let's say that the user knew their ID, right? That's how they said, hey, my ID is number 8, and I want you to update my record. Was it number 8? What was it? Number 3. Okay. Okay. And I want my new password to be chicken liver, whatever. Yeah, that's the new password. So again, we connect. We create our command here, our query. Update user set password or pass equal to something, right? Where ID equals something, right? Really easy. It's always just a question mark. And then you just fill in the question marks down here. Now, if you're familiar with how printf works in Java, if you're not, just ignore everything I'm about to say. But if you understand that, this kind of reminds me of that a little bit, where the way this bind parameter thing works, does that remind you of that a little bit? If that doesn't make sense to you, that's totally fine, but if that helps you to see it a little bit, then great. Exactly. Yep, it's very similar. Okay, so we're just going to say, well, the first thing is a string, and the second thing is an integer. And what's the string? It's, pass, and the integer is ID. That's it. Then we just execute it. Refresh. Let's look and see. 3 is lizard, and duck, it's going to be changed to chicken liver when we refresh. Or not, because we have an error maybe. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. Yeah, I'm on insert. Yeah, nice. So I just added, did I add a new record? Well, no, yeah. Okay, let's talk about exactly what happened there. Yeah, because I was running the insert page, right? I forgot to change this to the update page. It tried to insert 10 butthead word pass. Well, there's actually an error, the conflict, because 10 already exists, and that's a primary key, and you can't duplicate that. So if I were showing my error messages, I would see that, right? Okay, but I need to be running the other page called update. Update.php. Now that I've run that and I come in here, duck should change the chicken liver into dead. All right, how do we feel about all that mess? We good? Okay, these are called prepared statements, right? And they're tricky, and it takes a while to wrap your head around them, which is why I wanted to show you the old way and then slowly, one piece at a time, convert it so you can see what the counterparts are in both worlds. There's a whole other world out there called PDO, which stands for PHP Database Object. And that we're not going to even touch. It's messy, right? It's ugly and messy, and this totally works fine, and it's secure, and it's great. But just know you will probably run into it in the real world. And the PDO is, one of the things that's unique about it is it lets you use any kind of database you want. Right? Everything we're doing here is MySQL this, MySQL that, right? And MySQL I, okay? Well, we created a new object here called MySQL. That cleans it up a little bit because there's no more MySQL references anywhere. So I imagine that there is a Postgres object that we could do. Well, with the PDO object, you can just pick whatever database you want, okay? But that's way beyond the scope of an introduction to PHP, right? This is probably as advanced as we're ever going to get in this class right here. The other thing to keep in mind is this. All of this stuff we've been doing here, you got to hash this stuff, right? That whole encryption stuff we did, you can't just have this raw stuff sitting here. You got to hash it. You got to protect it. And so before you run all of this, you need to make sure you run this through your hash function or whatever you've got going. So any questions about anything we've covered today? Where you let the errors show, but then when you actually go live, right, you get rid of the reporting at all completely. Okay. Did I spell it? Oh, nice. Oh, I love that. Funny. Failed.